Christianity Today, you're listening to The Bulletin, a podcast about the events, issues, and people that are shaping our world. I'm Mike Cosper. I'm the director of CT Media. With me today is Russell Moore, CT's editor-in-chief. Our guests here at the roundtable today are Justin Giboney, an Atlanta-based lawyer and the co-founder and president of the AND campaign, and Michael Ware, a political strategist and the former director of faith-based initiatives at the Obama White House. Today, we're going to be talking about the elections, the results, what they tell us, what they don't tell us, about where we are, where the church is in terms of politics and public witness. We're also going to talk about pandemic amnesty, this idea that was floated last week and was not received well by most people. And then lastly, we're going to touch a little bit on the past, present, and future of Twitter. So stay with us. Okay, so we're recording this on Thursday morning. It's been an interesting week. I think we've all woke up on Wednesday a little bit surprised to see the results. I think I was listening to a podcast yesterday, and the comment from all of the hosts was essentially, no one knows anything at this point anymore. That we've had, depending on how you judge it, 4 to 6 election cycles now where the results have been rather unpredictable. I think the first question I'd like to throw out to you, Michael, would be, how do you see the results reflecting the state of the state of politics in the sense that we expected to see this emotional outrage, right, in a red wave. There's been a great deal of emotional outrage around the threat to democracy from the other side of the conversation. And yet you seem to, what has landed on our plates has been kind of lukewarm, right? Like there's either not a wave or there's 2 waves that are crashing together. What do you make of what we're seeing on Thursday morning now?
Yeah, I mean, the idea of 2 waves crashing together, I think, is one I want to think about quite a bit. I mean, one of the things I don't know if looking forward to is the right term, but, we have, as has become a common observation of politics, which is increasingly not about a common conversation, but about these sort of echo chamber conversations. And election day is really the one day where everyone has to look at the same object, where everyone is looking at the same thing, which is what happens when all of these echo chamber conversations, what happens when all of these narrow conversations actually meet. And I think that's what we saw on Election Day. I think that folks looking at the election results, even if they won't want to admit it or say it out loud, will have to, I would hope, come to terms with the fact that what infuriates them, what they center in their politics, is not what everybody else was centering. That it wasn't what everyone wasn't going to the polls voting on COVID, although I think there's an argument to be made. You look at the New York governor's race, yes, Hochul won, but by the time the votes were counted, I think Hochul's up by 5 percentage points. So it's not like these things didn't matter. I think it's more of a scenario where you got the sense that people were hoping that just emotional outrage would carry the day, when I'm actually somewhat encouraged that it seems like a significant percentage of voters looked and said, yes, inflation's a problem. Yes, COVID wasn't handled as well as we might like. But these are complicated issues. While the other side is saying, this is 100% the responsibility of the people in power, I actually think there's a bigger explanation here. I don't think the blame sort of falls on one party alone. And I think that goes for issues both on the right and the left, that voters in some ways were a check on some of the easy narratives that the parties and the political operatives were telling, and in that way, I'm encouraged a bit. But what we will head into 2023 with is what we've had for the last 2 years, what we've arguably had for the last decade, which is a bitterly divided political elite and a broader electorate that struggles to find voices within our politics that seem to be not interested in manipulating them, but actually taking a look at what's needed for constructive policymaking. And that's a tension that we're going to continue to see until our elected leaders and political operatives come to understand that that emotion alone isn't going to carry the day for them election after election.
That brings up another question that I think is interesting. And Justin, I'd love to hear you talk about this because, a big part of the work that you are doing is trying to bring a perspective, bring a voice into politics that brings together ideas that aren't represented by the polarity of politics as we know it. Do we see something in these results that reflects either a greater sense of sophistication by voters? Are we underestimating what people want and what people are willing to sort of think for themselves and make judgments for themselves and split tickets and vote really on what they care about rather than vote on the polarity? Is that part of what we're seeing? Are you optimistic because of what you're seeing?
I'm not convinced either way that there is a national trend or a national pattern that we can pull from this at all. I saw some things that were regional. We saw some things happen in the Southeast in Georgia and Florida that weren't reflected in a lot of other spaces. We saw things happen in Michigan that are probably very different than what's going on in Arizona. So I think it's going to take time. I'm not convinced that there was anything national that we can necessarily pull from this. And that makes it cleaner. It makes it easier. It's easier for commentators to talk about. But I'm not sure that's the case. It was more complicated than that from what it seems to me. I would hope, right? I hope it's saying that voters were more sophisticated. Michael talked about the inflation issue. I think people cared about that. I think people of all stripes had a serious concern about that. But where a lot of commentators thought, Biden would get all the blame and folks would run other ways, I think people realized that, well, does the Republican Party really have an answer for this? Maybe people do realize that it's not something that you can push a button and everything changes and there will no longer be inflation. It doesn't mean that the Democrats didn't do certain things wrong and overheat the economy, but maybe people were saying, well, we know it's not that simple. It's not that easy. You had people like McConnell, for instance, said, let's not really have an agenda. Then you have Scott on the other, on the other part of the Republican Party say, let's have an agenda. Let's tinker with Social Security. And then came back and said, well, no, we don't want to tinker with it. Maybe people did see through that. And so you have something like the economy and inflation where people are worried about it, but not enough to overwhelm all the other issues. Again, and even with inflation, I still don't know that we see a trend nationwide that we can say this is what Americans were thinking. Maybe we can say this is what Georgians were thinking, folks in Michigan were thinking. I don't know that there was a national trend to point to. Hopefully that is a sign of greater sophistication, not just being tribal, not just a reaction to who was in office at the time, but thinking it through more. I still think it's too early to say, though.
Russell, let me ask you this. There's been so much conversation in the last 7 years about the quote unquote evangelical vote. And, going back to 2016, this idea that 81% of evangelicals voted together as a bloc for Donald Trump. And then in the years that followed, those numbers kind of get picked apart. Once you start separating Christians who go to church and Christians who never go to church, the numbers get smaller and smaller. I'm wondering if when you look at where we are today, what does this tell us anything about what the church is doing, is voting, is thinking? Does it reflect anything new in that conversation?
I think the issue right now is less where did the evangelical vote go than it is what can evangelicals learn from what happened in the vote. And I do think that there was a national message coming out of this election, and it was this. Look at the numbers of those under 30 who were voting. I mean, one of the reasons why midterm elections are often not particularly what Democrats think they're going to be, is because there's this idea, well, young people are going to come out and vote, and they don't. The people who normally come out to vote in midterms are baby boomers, older people who are accustomed to voting. Not this year. And you look at what's happening, there was this sense of we can nominate, from the Republicans, we can nominate as crazy as can be, people who say we're going to not only deny that the election results from the last time, but we're going to keep the people's vote from counting next time when we have power for that to happen. And for the most part, those candidates lost, despite inflation, despite everything else. And so I think there's a tendency not in the politics of the nation, but the politics of the church, to assume that the way that we operate is to appeal to the loudest, angriest people who are in front of us right now. And what you end up doing is sacrificing the next generation who look at this and say, wait a minute, this is not real. And so I think there is a great deal of exhaustion. I mean, you look at what was coming up into the election. You had the reemergence of Donald Trump doing rallies all over the country, talking about 2-hour trials and shooting people and sending the bullet to their families. You think of the attack that happened on Paul Pelosi, and maybe even more relevantly, the sort of joking that would take place from a lot of candidates. I mean, that did not resonate in this election, and I think there are some important lessons to learn there.
Oh yeah, if I could just jump in, I really agree with Dr. Moore there. And the flip side of that is, I think so many times conservatives will say, and Christians will say, look, we have these principles, and either the American people are going to support them or reject them. They'll either win elections or lose elections, but it really doesn't matter how we carry them. It really doesn't matter how we talk about them. And to Dr. Moore's point, yes, we saw sort of more extreme candidates on the right side lose. We also saw, you look at Ohio and Governor DeWine winning re-election, annihilating the Democratic candidate. You see Brian Kemp in Justin's state of Georgia, who was someone who strong conservative, but was willing to reach out to those who weren't part of his base, who was willing to convince, who governed in a way that convinced a lot of Georgians that he's governing for the whole state. We don't agree with him all the time, but he's someone with an eye on the entire electorate, not just on a narrow base. And so kind of the encouragement there is, I talk about polarization a lot, and I think polarization is a profound force in our politics. These midterm results don't sort of erase the power of polarization, the toxicity of polarization. But we did see in this election some indications that there's only so far polarization is going to take is going to take sort of moderate Republicans and moderate Democrats. At some point, they draw the line and say, look, I know this person is of my party, but there's another way to go about advancing Republican or Democratic ideals without isolating the rest of the state. And if I was a Republican, I'd be looking at Mike DeWine, I'd be looking at Brian Kemp and saying, what did they have that allowed them in states where you had Democrats picking up seats and people like Raphael Warnock, contesting in the Senate election? What did Kemp have that Herschel Walker did not?
Well, you also ought to look at some of these elections that were lost. Jamie Herrera Butler's seat, Peter Meyer's seat. These are Republicans who, because of their deeply felt convictions about what is right, voted for impeachment, were hounded out of the party in primaries in Republican districts. Who won? I mean, Jamie Herrera Butler is replaced with a candidate who was speaking to white nationalist podcasts and defending Nick Fuentes, a literal fascist. They lost. Democrats won those red seats because there's a limit to what people will take. And I think there was this idea, well, if you're not with us 100%, we're going to hound you out of the tribe, and no one has any option but to elect whoever we put up instead. And that proved not to be true.
And I would say that I hope this is the case. So I'm with the other two and hoping that. But I think we do have to see Carrie Lake is still out there. I mean, I don't know if you get too much worse in that regard. In Nevada, you have the Republican senator. I mean, look, Walker in Georgia was running against Warnock, who's an incumbent. What Kemp had that Walker didn't have was an incumbency. And so I think that's a big part of it. And so, again, I think there is an argument for some regional differences here. But I'm hoping that people are seeing it, even if it's starting one region or another, that people are seeing that the election denial, all those things has to get thrown out the door because we have real issues in education, with the economy and so on that we really have to deal with.
Yeah, and I think the governance point is a good point, Michael. And what's interesting to me and I think stands out in the pack is, of course, Florida itself, right? So Florida, DeSantis has won by 20 points. He's flipped Miami-Dade County, and his policies are extremely popular in the state. And when he campaigns as a culture-warring, Trumpy candidate. Does that tell us something about the electorate as well? Like, is he the guy who's basically saying, look, I'll give you the best of both worlds. I'll govern in a way that you like, and I'll also do the performative, professional wrestler routine as part of my campaigning and drawing people together.
I think what's important is, yes, DeSantis has done, some of the quote unquote, sort of culture warring. He's addressed issues like public education. But, you look at DeSantis's approach on abortion, and he said pro-life rhetoric, but he didn't go beyond Florida's 15-month or 15-week law. You look at the exit polls from the midterms and the national exit polls, I think people would be surprised. 50% of the country thought that the national conversation around gender issues was going in the wrong direction, in a bad direction. Now, the problem is that didn't dictate, people didn't view that as the singular issue driving their vote. So there has to be I think social conservatives need to recognize we could win on that issue, but there are a lot of other reasons that people would vote. But I think DeSantis, yes, has that tone. Yes, is willing to pick fights, but at the policy level, like you said, the actual policies he implements are quite popular across the state, and that is so independents living in the state hear Democrats say, "Oh, this guy's an extremist." This guy, but they look at our lives. We're not seeing, from their perspective, we're not seeing policies that have upended our existence and that kind of thing. And so I think it's a really interesting thing. I'd also Marco Rubio performed really well in the state too. So I do think that I think it's a story about the Republican Party in Florida, not necessarily just, oh, DeSantis is this great politician. I think we're seeing deeper trends in Florida politics, particularly, that flip in Miami-Dade. We didn't see the Hispanic vote sort of transform nationally like that, but there is something with the Cuban vote in Miami-Dade that has been building for a long time that seemed to have really crested in this election that Democrats are going to have to pay some real attention to.
Let's talk about the Dobbs decision and how that has shaped things. Abortion was on the ballot in a variety of ways. There was an amendment in my own state, I live in Kentucky, about abortion. Did that make a significant impact on what we saw on Tuesday?
Yes. I mean, obviously from the exit polling, it did, both in terms of people's votes and also in terms of mobilization of voters. And here's what I think is important as somebody who's been working in the pro-life movement for 25 years. There were always those people who would say, well, don't worry about the law. Let's simply worry about persuading people not to have abortions. And that's not a right position. The law has to protect the vulnerable. But it's also true that there are people who assume, well, if you just have the law, then you don't have to persuade people as to why we ought to care about the lives of unborn children. And when you add to that this sense of you really can't build a pro-life ethic if you have a derision of vulnerability. And so when you have this cognitive dissonance of pro-life, but erosion of norms, civility, hatred of vulnerable people, that doesn't feel real to people, and they start to assume that that's just a trick. And so what has to happen is it could be possible that what we end up with is similar to what you see in Ireland, which was always the pro-life Catholic outlier and is now solidly pro-choice, that the same thing could happen with voters under 30 who are forming their political identities right now. You could end up with an America that is far more pro-abortion rights than it ever was before. That's why those of us who are pro-life have to come in and say, okay, this isn't a partisan wedge issue. This is about persuading people to care for women in crisis and for their children, and that we can do both.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, Dobbs certainly mattered. The law matters as well as culture. So we do have to have that multiple-pronged approach when we discuss it. And this is what worried me. I mean, if you look at what happened with Proposal 3 in Michigan, a lot, after the Dobbs decision came down, there was a lot of triumphalism. And I always thought it was way too premature, that it wasn't even, that it was almost hurtful to react to it in that way. And also to allow a number of conservative elected officials and leaders to speak about it and even make proposals that were reckless. And of course, when you make those proposals, when you speak about it in that way, the other side is going to take, or the pro-choice side is going to take those talking points and take what you said, those quotes, and they're going to make a big deal about it. And I think they opened up an opportunity that if the Dobbs decision was handled differently and the reaction was different, that it could have kind of toned it down a bit and been prepared for a fight on the state level. Now, I know there's plenty of people that have been doing this for a long time who were fighting on the state level, folks out in Michigan who are fighting Proposal 3, but it's something we got to think about. Lastly, I would say this. I think it brings the clear need. What happened on Tuesday brings a clear need for different messengers too. I think there are a number of people of color out there that can speak well on this issue and that need to be brought to the forefront in this debate because I think it's the argument is pigeonholed as if it comes from just a certain group of people. And I think in certain times that credibility there isn't always there. Let's bring some other voices into the conversation and get this rolling. And I agree with Dr. Moore in a more nonpartisan way, but surely a more diverse way when it comes to demographics.
Yeah, I mean, I think both of those comments are spot on. I just add Dobbs changed the rules of abortion politics. I mean, abortion politics just does not function post-Dobbs in the way that it has typically functioned for 50 years. And one of the main reasons for that is that the pro-life side had the benefit of being the underdog, of not having teeth because it didn't have at least the American people didn't judge the pro-life side to have the legal sort of ability to enforce what they were advocating for. After Dobbs, all of a sudden pro-lifers could be perceived as the aggressor in this culture war, and that requires a different approach. And it just requires that you need to think about the power you're wielding in a different way. And to Dr. Moore's point, I think that there is more openness among the American electorate for pro-life legislation that is advanced by people who uphold a pro-life ethic, who uphold the culture of life. What the American people are definitely going to reject is pro-life legislation wielded as a political tool by people who don't themselves seem to uphold the dignity of the human person. And that is something that I think we should understand. We should understand why that would be rejected and take seriously, to Justin's point, who are the voices, who are the leaders who are advancing pro-life legislation, and are they people who live with integrity, not just when they're in front of a podium, but throughout the whole of their life.
Well, think about the Herschel Walker campaign. Not so much the particular issue of whether or not Herschel Walker paid for abortions, but the reaction from pro-life people who would go on television and would say, well, even if that's the case, even if he was paying for abortions, and even if he's now lying about that, we still are going to support him because he will be a vote for ending lots of abortions. I mean, that is not the sort of personal moral credibility that can reach to people and say, here's why you ought to really care about this. When people see that, they think, oh, well, then this is just a tool. It's not really anything real. And you can't sustain a pro-life movement on that.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, being here in Georgia, I can't tell you how many of my more progressive friends who know I'm pro-life would send me the articles about the next woman coming out saying that Walker actually asked her to have an abortion. And I think Georgia was an example of bad Christian politics when it comes to the abortion issue. You had obviously Walker, who seemed to be a hypocrite in that regard. Then you had Warnock, who I think talked about abortion in a very irresponsible way, a lot different than the folks in the black church that I know talk about it. And so there really wasn't that. You had two black Christian men, but they really didn't have the representation of, especially on that issue, that I think a lot of people in our community do. And it made it tough for a lot of people. I mean, from a practical standpoint, I think some people were saying, well, yeah, Walker, I didn't vote for him in the primary. I don't want to deal with him at all. But I think some Republicans were saying, but this could be a potential Supreme Court seat. He is going to vote pro-life. And so I think it did complicate it for some folks who otherwise would completely have rejected him pursuant to character.
Well, and I think there's a challenge, presented by the Trump story, because lots of people said, well, man, I'm going to roll the dice on voting for Donald Trump, even though I have these other objections because I'm worried about the courts, I'm worried about abortion. And then Trump delivers on his promise to elect, or to nominate pro-life judges, and it sets the conditions for the court to be what it is. I think part of what I wonder in all of this is, what does it tell us about the moral and ethical imagination of Christians and believers, and really of the sort of the body politic, right? That there's, I think there's the old saying that hypocrisy is the compliment that vice plays to virtue, right? Like that there's an element of that at work in the way we've thought about the pro-life issues with politicians like Trump and politicians like Herschel Walker. But I think there's also an element in which you kind of see the people saying, "Nah, I'm not buying it. I'm not gonna buy into what I'm being sold," which is like, hey, it doesn't matter what they actually do; it just matters what they're going to empower. I also think it says something about the way we think about ethics, and accomplishing public ethic, right? If I can, by sort of strength of will, strength of policy, get something done, that's good enough. And that leaves the moral imagination untouched, which isn't actually going to change anything. It's just going to drive the issues either other ways, or it's going to create new fights and new venues, which is part of what I think you see on the other side of Dobbs. Is there wasn't necessarily a lot of ground won on the imagination side, so the decision comes down, and it seems like with these different referenda and with what we're seeing with the candidates, people are sort of saying, well, we don't want this. We're rejecting it.
Well, and it reinforces the problem, because to say, well, we have to do things that violate our conscience in order to get a greater good. That's exactly the conversation that someone is having walking into an abortion clinic. This is wrong. This is awful, but I have to do it in order to live the life and maybe to care for my other children or so forth. Once you get the idea that the ends matter, but the ways and means don't, then what you end up doing is empowering that very, all of those forces that you think are the problem. And I think that's what we're seeing.
Let's pivot to another topic, actually, that I think is connected to this. Last week, Emily Oster wrote a piece about the idea of pandemic amnesty. And I think the gist of the piece is saying, look, if you look across the board in the way politicians and sort of different tribes in our country, the way we responded to COVID, everybody got something wrong. Everybody got certain aspects of it wrong. This side sort of turned it into a culture war. That side, there was overreach in terms of how policies were written and enforced and the way the expectations were. Why don't we just sort of let's have an amnesty. Let's let bygones be bygones, and have a sort of spirit of forgiveness and move forward. That was not received well, to say the least. There was a lot of frustration and pushback on it. It also came around the same time as an SNL sketch that was sort of it was a digital short, and sort of the joke of the sketch was, hey, if you're tired, if you're worn out, you want to get away from a few days off from work, why don't you try COVID? And as sort of a joke that get COVID, you'll get a few days off work and get a chance to get some rest. That also was not received well. So I think you can say we're not in a laughing mood about COVID yet in the United States, by and large, and that emotions around this stuff run really high. We've already talked a little bit about how I think there was an expectation that COVID was going to be seen in the results from Tuesday. I don't know that it was, but where do we go from here? I'd be curious your thoughts. Let me start with you, Justin. When you think about this idea of pandemic amnesty, when you look at the communities that you serve and you speak for, do you see a spirit of animosity and frustration around COVID policies and the consequences of that are unfolding right now? How are you thinking about the consequences of COVID and how they're going to play out in our communities in the coming couple of years here?
I'm extremely concerned. To answer the first part of your question, I think in general, we all know that as Christians, our disposition, our posture should be one of forgiveness. It should be one of peacemaking. The vengeance, the I told you so, we really just don't have time for that. We have to be solution oriented. And whatever we do, whether it's amnesty or whether it is holding people accountable, it has to be about solutions. It has to be about human flourishing, because there are too many problems going on. So I'll say that the vengeance, the partisanship, the culture war, it just has to stop, because especially when it comes to our children, there's some things that we have to deal with. Now, I do think we should pay attention to who got things more right when it comes to things like education, the economy, and crime, because we can't correct them if we don't really take a look at that. And that may mean holding some people accountable who maybe shouldn't be on the school board anymore. I mean, depending how they responded to things. So I don't think it's a matter of completely forgetting what happened, especially when it comes to education, which is what worries me the most. If you look at what's going on, we have in some areas children that are, our education, we're set back when it comes to reading almost 2 decades. And obviously, when it comes to lower income people, the impacts get worse and worse. And you had a moment where I think we would all agree that in early 2020, maybe throughout most of 2020, it made sense to err on the side of caution. But there was a point when the data came out, and the data made it fairly clear that schools should be open. There was a certain ideological approach that left schools closed. And we're left with a generation of kids that may not recover. I'm prayerful that, that we can keep working at it. And we know that there was going to be certain losses when it comes to learning in general, just based on the pandemic. but it could have been handled better. The last thing that I'll bring up is how we handle science. I think the mainstream media could have handled the science of it a little better as well. Think back. There was a moment when people were literally being censored for even talking about the lab leak theory, for even bringing it up. Now we come today, we get a report out of the Senate that says the lab leak theory might be the most likely a means of the spread, or how it all started. But are we talking about gain of function? Why is gain of function still being funded in ways that it probably shouldn't be funded? And are we going to address some of the conflicts of interest that came with some of what we thought were noble lies? But in the end, there's some things going on that I think have to be addressed. So amnesty altogether may be too strong. Being solution oriented and making sure that we're aimed towards human flourishing is the best way to go, in my opinion.
Russell, let me ask you this. One of the things that I saw constantly in the reaction to the amnesty piece in particular was assigning motive to the people you disagreed with. We can't have amnesty because these people XYZ, whether it was about the exercise of power, whether it was because they didn't care about their neighbor, they were committing genocide of old people. It goes from a policy disagreement, I think this is the best thing, to this good versus evil, moral absolutes stuff. What is it in us that drives us towards that kind of assigning that kind of moral motive, ethical motive to our neighbors?
Creed Bratton on The Office said one time that he had been in many cults, both as a follower and as a leader, and you have more fun as a follower, but you make more money as a leader. I always, in all of these conversations, want to differentiate between the leader and the followers. Yeah. And so you have different sorts of things going on. I have neighbors in my community who were really convinced that hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin would deal with COVID. I have a very different attitude toward them. They were receiving information and maybe they just trusted the wrong people for that information. I take that in a different light than I do the people who knew that this was just tribal signaling and we're trying to do that as a marketing tool. So I think we have to, that's why I don't think the conversation of amnesty is really a good one. You have to differentiate between just good faith making wrong decisions. And I think the same thing on the other side. You had a lot of school boards and teachers who are saying, look, we don't know how to do this without spreading this to our communities. And so they maybe kept schools shut a little longer than they should have. But then you also have some teachers' unions and others who were acting as though schools should be closed indefinitely. And knew better. And so I think we have to differentiate those things. And I do think it's important, not in terms of exercising vengeance toward one another, but to step back and say, okay, what can we learn about the assumptions that we all had in this? And one of the things I think we learned was that as much as we were hoping that a big national emergency would somehow unify the country, it didn't. That you can't have that kind of unifying if you have the breakdown of trust that we have. And part of that breakdown of trust is because of what Amanda Ripley calls conflict entrepreneurs, people who really know how to exploit and to accelerate those dissipations of trust. I think that is what we ought to learn out of this.
Michael, let me ask you a question. I think you look at church history, one of the things that shows up time and time again is in moments of crisis, moments of plague and disease and whatnot, the church often thrives in the midst of it because the church had a response that moved towards serving the sick, serving those that were in need in those moments. What do we make of the fact that the church has, because of some of the loudness of the voices of the church, in terms of what's being amplified in the media, the church's reputation in terms of how COVID was managed, by and large, doesn't seem to have been great. It seems to have been what was amplified anyway. Seems to have been an amplification of the people who wanted to make it into a fight and who wanted to draw lines in the sand and pick fights with local municipalities and whatnot. I guess the question I would ask would be two parts. One is that a fair, is what we're seeing, is that a fair amplification of the reality? And number two, why, what do you make of the drive towards turning this into a polarizing issue, which is really a question both for the church and more broadly?
Yeah. Well, I mean, so look, I understand we take the assumption that Christians are going to be doing things for the good of others. So we don't state those things out loud and we focus on where the conflict is. And so I don't want to do the opposite of that. I spend time with pastors every day, and I know how the burden so many pastors were facing financially because of just the practical impacts of COVID, but also just in shepherding a congregation where every decision they made around COVID precautions, whether it was ordered by the state or not, opened them up to not just questions of politicization and why aren't you taking a stand, but don't you believe in the value of the church congregating? And for pastors to be presented with those kinds of accusations is just really something else. But I do feel like it's important to say, look, there are countless shut-ins and people who became shut-ins because of COVID, that if it was not for the church, they would not have gotten groceries every week because churches set up systems in which to make sure that the people who are in their congregations were tended to. If not for the church, we would not have been able to see so much of the emotional, social, material support that helped see not just the church, but the country through COVID. If it wasn't for, and I mean, like, it's important to say, if it wasn't for Christians who started hospitals and started medical nonprofits, then the entire medical infrastructure that we're even having these conversations about would not exist, And so, it's just so important. Yes, let's talk about pastors who were saying crazy things from the pulpit about chips and arms and all that kind of thing. But I just want to make sure that we're not avoiding the overwhelming contribution to the public good that Christians have made in the areas of medicine, of serving those who are affected by epidemics, et cetera, et cetera. When it comes to this polarization question, you saw folks who felt like systems were working against them, leveraging some of the same kind of rhetoric that they would critique among communities who talk about systemic oppression. And so all of a sudden, I don't know if you saw these signs. All of a sudden, the businesses and conservative areas would put up signs saying, we don't discriminate on the basis of race, religion. But the whole point why they put up the sign is because it added vaccinated or unvaccinated. They didn't have the "we don't discriminate" signs up before. They only put the sign up to say, look, this is the new discriminated against community. So I do think there was a really troubling emotional sort of need, psychological need that people were meeting with being able to leverage this sort of rhetoric in ways that weren't necessarily reflective of the situation, of the information that we had. The last thing I'd say is just to defend the Oster piece. I wrote about this. I deeply admire Emily Oster for writing this piece. What's important to understand is that if there's anyone in the country that has the right to be doing victory laps around education and school closures, it's Oster. She was one of the very first public champions of saying, look, the data is not justifying the educational harms that school closures are having. And she expressed concerns about masking and the effect that that had on education. And so her writing the piece, to me, was it was her saying, she didn't say it explicitly, which I think was valuable too. But the piece was, look, I could be doing victory laps and raising money off of the fact that I was right and all these people who wanted to harm your children were wrong. But we need to let go of some of those personal animosities. My view on the piece was that she wasn't saying, don't vote against Kathy Hochul or DeSantis if you thought that their policies were wrong. But like others have said, it was, look, maybe the local business owner who felt like they needed to shut down, maybe you disagree with their position, but maybe that's not a grudge you should hold against a local business owner. Or maybe the school principal, maybe they should have been more bold in confronting the school superintendent or the school board. But maybe you give these local people, the relationships we have, family members who weren't as respectful of the precautions you thought were necessary or imposed precautions on you that you thought were not necessary. Maybe we just need to understand like the fog of war here and not have the next 3 years of our life be dominated by these animosities in the way that the previous 3 years were. And I think that's a wise thing. While, as Dr. Moore said, yes, purveyors of willful disinformation, people who were willfully using COVID as a way to aggrandize themselves or harm others. Yeah, that needs to be held to account. As Justin said, we need to look at the CDC and our public health systems and why they didn't function as well. As they have said, Dr. Collins of NIH has said, there were things we got wrong. Okay, so let's look at what we got wrong because this isn't the last pandemic we're going to face. I mean, we're dealing with monkeypox. There's the respiration issues. So it's not backward looking to say, how could we improve in the future?
Last topic for the day. We are, watching sort of day by day, Twitter is evolving. Some of us are on Twitter more than others. Some of us are intentionally very, shall we say, have a high fence around our Twitter feeds because of what we've experienced negatively on Twitter. I think we could probably all agree that the effect of social media, and Twitter in particular, on our political conversations is that it contributes to some of the worst tendencies, the polarization, and the loud noise, the violent sort of threats and attacks. I know probably all of us have been heard vile things via social media over the years. At the same time, I just finished this, lengthy series on the rise and fall of Mars Hill. Social media played a critical role in holding abusive leaders to account in that church, played a critical role in the Me Too movement, played a critical role in the Church Too movement, played a critical role in uncovering abuse within the SBC. When you think about, the potential that Twitter's going to be a radically different place, or that this could be the greatest blunder in the history of entrepreneurship, and, Elon Musk is going to lose $44 billion and the thing will be gone in a year. Is that a net loss or a good for the life of the church, the witness of the church, and the state of our politics? Let's start with you, Justin.
Ooh, yeah, I'd say that's tough to calculate. I mean, from one end, I don't know that I could have started the AND campaign the way I did and met some of the people and been introduced to some of the people that are a part of it now and that have, contributed to it without Twitter and other parts of social media. I don't know if I could have done that. At the same time, I do see the negative that comes with it, the anonymity, the tribalism, the ways people talk to others that they would never speak to them in person in that way, but somehow feel empowered and incentivized even to communicate in that way. And not just folks who are secular. We're talking about Christians here. We're talking about Christians who really use Twitter to troll, to somehow think they're they can bring back some kind of renaissance of orthodoxy by trolling people and speaking to them in ways that I don't know how you read the Bible and justify the insult for insult and the things that we see on Twitter. So I don't think we can go backwards. This is, to some extent, a Pandora's box. We can only move forward. You can't take it away, regardless of what happens with Elon Musk. Something Twitter-like or something that moves this forward is going to be there. We can't go backwards, but I think, especially for Christians, we can think about how to discipline ourselves and what we incentivize on Twitter or whatever the next iteration of this will be, to make it a more constructive conversation, to mitigate some of this toxicity, and we certainly can't continue to participate in it.
Michael?
It's hard to say whether the shuttering of Twitter would be a net positive, because something's going to fill the vacuum. And so just Twitter closing down doesn't mean that the capacities and the opportunities that Twitter presented go away. In the book I co-author with Justin and our brother Chris Butler, Compassion and Conviction, there's a closing chapter where we talk about Howard Thurman's book, Jesus and the Disinherited. And Thurman talks about the development of hatred as involving something he calls contact without fellowship. And in that context, he was talking about, he kind of gives the example of, say you were in a car driving through a neighborhood that was not your own, and you look out the window and you kind of feel like you're getting a sense of what's happening in the neighborhood, and you sort of take, you make judgments based on that, but you're not really experiencing the neighborhood. You're driving by with your window up and just catching, blurry glances at what's happening. And social media, and I'd say like Twitter especially, it gives you the impression that, oh, I'm getting an inside look at what my political opponents really think, when often what you're catching is, just a faint reflection of a sort of caricature of a sort of a carnival house view of what people not like you think and act and what they say. And that is something we need to contend with. We need to make sure that we're not developing hatreds on this sort of false fellowship that we're getting out of social media.
Russell Moore.
What concerns me is if you look at the last week, Elon Musk, new owner of Twitter, seems to be embodying in his own person, some of the worst aspects of Twitter, spreading misinformation and disinformation in the Paul Pelosi case, the sort of trolling of various people, including his own advertisers in this case. And it doesn't seem to me that that's taking it in a better direction. And there was a book, Breaking the Social Media Prism, came out last year, that made the point that most people on Twitter are not crazy. Most people on Twitter are actually normies, but they're not posting, because the more crazy you have, the more the normies step back because they have lives. It's going to cost them something if they act like a jerk on Twitter. What worries me is that is being replicated in real life. And so you see the sort of troll culture pushing more reasonable people out of spaces. You see that happening in churches. You see it happening in denominations. You see it happening in political parties. And if we don't get at that really starts with this play acting on social media and then starts to become, one of the things we know from Scripture is that the more that you act in a certain way, the more you become that sort of person, or you end up disintegrating and sort of taking your feelings and your thoughts and you're separating them. That leads to nowhere good. And that's what we have to, I think, address.
And if I could add, I think that's a great point by Dr. Moore. One thing that also helps these kind of tribal leaders who might not have the best of intentions is the complete lack of proportion and frequency that Twitter and the internet bring, right? So they can take any instance. Someone in Montana says the N-word, and they can make it seem like it was the person next door and that it's happening every second right near you. And I think as Christians, we need to get some perspective, get a sense of proportion and frequency to say, I'm not going to overreact. I'm not going to let these folks put me into a rage every time something like this comes up. It may be a problem, may not be a problem. I'm not going to overreact every time it comes up because this is a little bit skewed and there may be a better way to look at it.
And it's not just the sort of trolling and misinformation that Justin just mentioned. It's also the fact that it for most things, it takes an amount of attention and reflection to change one's mind on something. And we know from study after study after study, the minute that somebody takes a public commitment to something, it becomes really difficult for that person to change his or her mind because they're out there, they're publicly committed. You look at sort of the culture that comes around Twitter, where if somebody doesn't respond to something immediately, then it's silence. When in fact, what might be happening is that person is looking and wondering and pondering,
right.
And that's what we lose.
Just to maybe circle back to the beginning of our conversation, Eitan Hirsch has this concept of political hobbyists. And he says the problem with political hobbyists is that what they are approaching politics as sort of consumers. And their political mode is they think that tweeting is engaging in politics, but the very nature of how they engage in politics is actually anti-political. The kind of skills that you hone by debating an issue with someone over Twitter are actually, it's not just that they're counterproductive, or it's not just that it's not politics, it's that exactly to Dr. Moore's point, the kind of person you're becoming by engaging in political talk that way actually makes you less able to actually do the work of politics. And so that political hobbyism is something we need to be careful for.
Yeah, absolutely. To chime in on what you were saying a moment ago, Russell, Lord forbid we had a culture where people took time to think about what they thought about something before they said something about it. We've certainly lost a lot of that in our moment. For my part, I've narrowed my feed where it's almost exclusively like, friends, people I really admire, and 90% of it is Indianapolis Colts news, which is also incredibly depressing this year.
Yes.
So as far as I'm concerned, goodbye to the hellscape that is Twitter, and let's on with the next thing. All right, it's been a crazy week. Sleepless nights, long nights, nonstop news, nonstop confusion. Where the weekend is almost here. What do each of you plan to do to sort of catch your breath over the weekend, if that's even possible this week? Let's start with you, Michael.
Yeah, it's my eldest daughter's birthday month, and we started a tradition last year of I'll take her into the city. We'll have dinner. We'll stay at a hotel overnight and jump on the bed and that kind of thing. And she is just she's turning 4, so she's even more like cognizant and excited about it. So she's been talking about it for months, and that's what we're doing this weekend. And I can't wait. I have a trip up to New York now, and I'll get back Friday night, and then we'll do that this weekend. It's going to be a blast.
Fantastic, Justin.
My middle son is in the playoffs in football, so I'll be watching his game, step away and enjoy that, and then going to church on Sunday and loving on my fellow Christians. How
about you, Russell?
Well, this sounds like work, but it actually is a good deal of how I unwind, and that's teaching Sunday school. I still say Sunday school. I'm still a Southern Baptist, I guess, at heart. I'm in a non-denominational church that calls it Sunday seminar or something like that. But teaching through Genesis with people I love, and the calling of Abraham this weekend. I'm looking forward to that.
My youngest is starring in a musical based on the life of Stan Lee. She is Stephanie. She has a different last name, but it's basically the life of Stan Lee, and she gets to become a superhero in the show and fight villains, and essentially with a lightsaber that's made of a pencil because she's the comic book artist. So we're excited about that. I'll be running sound, I think, for the entire thing. So I will be sitting behind the soundboard all weekend. So
Excelsior.
Hey, thanks.
That's great.
Thanks Sorry, what was that?
I said Excelsior in honor of Stanley.
Exactly. Well, hey, thanks to each of you for making time for this on a busy week. So glad we could have these conversations. And thank you for listening to the Bulletin, and we will see you here next week. Thanks again to Justin Giboney, Michael Ware, and Russell Moore for joining me today on the podcast. You can learn more about their work in our show notes. The Bulletin is a production of Christianity Today. It's executive produced by Eric Petrick. The host is Mike Cosper. It's produced by Mike Cosper and Azure Phelps. Our graphic design is by Brian Todd. Our social media is by Kate Lucky. Director of Operations for CT Media is Matt Stevens. Music by Dan Phelps. Production assistance by Core Media. Coordinator, Beth Gravencourt. Audio engineer, Kevin Duthu. Video producer, John Rowland. Thanks for listening to The Bulletin. We'll see you here again next Friday.